I want to start with the winter, not the mines, not the copper, not the 10,000 years of extraction that geological surveys have been trying to explain for more than a century. The winter of 1888, a cabin somewhere in Ojibwe country, an old man who had spent most of his life avoiding a specific conversation, finally deciding that the time for avoiding it had passed. He sent for his grandson. He asked for writing materials to be brought into the room. That request alone, an elder asking for records, not memories, was unusual enough that the grandson remembered it decades later. The old man did not want recollections that would fade and distort with time. He wanted something that would survive him. Something that could be carried forward by whoever came next, even if that person did not yet exist. For 3 days he spoke about copper, not the copper that the mining companies arriving from the east were already extracting with steam equipment and railway access. The copper that had been coming out of the Lake Superior Basin for thousands of years before anyone alive in 1888 could remember the beginning of it. The copper that government surveyors were already cataloguing in thousands of ancient pits scattered across the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale. The copper whose destination remained in 1888 as now one of the most persistently unanswered questions in the archaeology of the North American continent. The old man had things to say about all of it. 3 weeks after he finished speaking, he was dead. If you've followed this channel, you know that the most important historical testimony is rarely the testimony that makes it into official records. Subscribe now. Because what this elder said in that cabin in 1888 connects directly to the largest unresolved question in ancient American archaeology. For most of his adult life, the elder had avoided the subject deliberately. Surveyors asked about the old copper workings. Missionaries asked. Mining men arriving from the east asked. The elder usually answered questions about weather, fishing routes, winter crossings, and the movement of game through the forests. The practical knowledge of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating the landscape of the upper Great Lakes. But conversations about the ancient pits rarely lasted long before he changed the subject or simply stopped speaking altogether. The grandson later wrote that he had noticed this pattern throughout his childhood without understanding it. His grandfather was not a man who struggled to speak. He was a man who had chosen not to speak about certain things, and the distinction was visible even to a child. That changed in the winter of 1888. By then, the elder was already ill. The family knew he was dying, and according to the grandson's account, the old man knew it too. What changed was not his willingness to speak. What changed was his calculation about what silence would cost. The grandson's notes describe the 3 days in careful sequence. On the first evening, the old man spoke about places on Isle Royale that his grandson had never visited, locations of ancient workings that the grandson had no way to verify or investigate. He spoke about old pits on the Keweenaw Peninsula that were already considered ancient before industrial mining reached the region. He described routes across the water that no longer existed in the form he knew them. He spoke about the mines themselves with a familiarity that came not from personal excavation, but from something older. Knowledge received rather than acquired, passed down through a lineage that had been custodians of this information for longer than any document could confirm. The word that recurred throughout the surviving notes was inherited, not discovered, not built, not found, inherited. His people, the elder told his grandson, had become custodians of places that were already old when the oldest remembered stories began. The mines did not belong to them in the sense of ownership. They belonged to them in the sense of responsibility. The responsibility of a generation that receives something intact and is expected to pass it forward the same way. And then, on the first evening, the grandson asked the question that had been building, since the old man began speaking, if the Ojibwe had inherited the mines who had worked them before. The old man remained quiet long enough that the grandson wondered whether he intended to answer at all. Finally he spoke. The people who came before, he said, had arrived from the direction where the son is oldest. The grandson wrote the sentence down exactly as he heard it, because he knew immediately that he did not understand it. By the time the elder spoke those words in 1888, the physical evidence of the ancient copper industry was already becoming impossible to ignore. Government surveys throughout the Lake Superior Basin had been documenting thousands of prehistoric mining pits. Excavations stretching dozens of feet into the bedrock, containing stone hammers weighing 20 and 30 pounds, wooden shaft supports preserved in anaerobic pit sediments, evidence of fire-setting technique used to fracture copper-bearing rock. In some locations, mining activity extended across such large areas that surveyors struggled to determine where one operation ended and another began. The scale was the problem. The societies assumed responsible for this work were characterized in the archaeological literature of the period as small, scattered, largely seasonal. That characterization and the physical evidence of the mines could not be made to occupy the same historical picture without serious strain. Small, scattered, seasonal populations do not produce thousands of organized extraction pits across an archipelago and a peninsula. They do not maintain wooden shoring in deep excavations. They do not develop fire-setting technique and apply it systematically across multiple sites over multiple generations. The elder had no access to those surveys. He had never read a geological report or an archaeological field journal. What he had was the knowledge his lineage had been carrying, and according to his grandson's notes, he found the question the surveys were asking deeply misguided. People kept asking who discovered the mines. He told his grandson, but the mines did not need discovering. Everyone had always known they were there. The real question, the question that the surviving accounts suggested nobody was asking with sufficient seriousness, was who opened them first, and why they had been working copper on a scale that later generations could barely explain. The mines were one part of a system, the elder said. The water was another. Separating the two made the story stop making sense. What role the lakes played in the process was never explained in terms the grandson felt comfortable translating into English decades later, but the insistence on the connection, mines and water as components of a single integrated system rather than independent features of the same landscape, appears repeatedly enough in the surviving notes to constitute a central element of what the old man was passing down. The mines do not dig themselves. Copper does not move itself. Thousands of pits spread across islands and shorelines do not appear without planning, transportation systems, food production, seasonal coordination, and generations of accumulated knowledge. The elder was not arguing that the people responsible lacked those capacities. He was arguing something different. He believed the mines belonged to a period when the world around Lake Superior was organized very differently from the one that existed in 1888. On the second day, the conversation moved toward the people the elder had mentioned the evening before. The people from the direction where the sun is oldest. This time he spoke more carefully, and what he said was not what the grandson had expected. These earlier miners had not been enemies of his ancestors. They had not been rivals or conquerors. According to the elder, his people and the earlier miners had shared the copper country. They understood the metal differently and used it differently. But both groups considered the deposits around the Great Lakes important enough to protect and important enough to remember. The distinction the old man drew repeatedly was between ownership and stewardship. Later generations would speak about the mines in terms of who had rights to them. The elder spoke about them in terms of who carried responsibility for them. That difference was not incidental. It was, in his telling, fundamental to understanding what the mines had actually been. Then came the sentence that would become one of the most discussed lines in the surviving document. The people before the silence, the elder said, did not simply take copper from the ground. They listened to it. The grandson admitted decades later that he never fully understood what his grandfather meant. Neither, apparently, had his grandfather intended him to. Some knowledge, he was told, survives one generation only long enough to reach another generation that can finally understand it. The grandson's responsibility was not to explain the words. The cemetery itself, his responsibility was to keep them alive, long enough for somebody else to try. What the grandson understood more clearly was the phrase that had been appearing throughout the conversation since the first evening, the time before the silence. It appears repeatedly in the surviving notes. It is never fully explained. The grandson later wrote that every mention of it changed his grandfather's expression in a way he struggled to describe even decades afterward. The silence was not a war. It was not an invasion. It was not the arrival of another people. The old man spoke about it as though it was a change in the world itself rather than a conflict inside it. The first change involved water. The elder described rivers moving differently than they had before, shorelines behaving in ways his ancestors had not expected, water arriving where it had not arrived before, water failing to arrive where it always had. Whether he was speaking about floods, changing lake levels, altered waterways, or something more complicated, the grandson never became confident enough to decide. He wrote the words down exactly as he received them, and left the interpretation to whoever came later. The second change involved something the grandson found even harder to translate. The old man spoke about forms of exchange and understanding that existed before the silence and disappeared afterward. Not literacy, not trade, not diplomacy, something older and broader than any of those things. The grandson later wrote that his grandfather spoke about this loss with the same matter-of-fact certainty a farmer speaks about weather, or a sailor speaks about currents. To the old man, the disappearance of that connection was not philosophy. It was history. If you're still here, you're beginning to understand why the elder waited until the final weeks of his life to speak. What he was describing was not a legend. It was a cartography of a world that no longer existed, and he needed someone to hold the map. Subscribe, because what he said about the structures near the mines is where this story becomes something else entirely. On the third day, the conversation turned to what the elder called structures dressed in earth. The grandson admitted he did not know whether this phrase meant buried structures, structures deliberately covered, or something the English language had no precise equivalent for. His grandfather apparently assumed the meaning was obvious and never stopped to explain it. The phrase continued appearing in the conversation, as though both men already understood what it referred to. Decades later, only one of them still did. The old man believed some of these places still existed, not standing, not visible, but present. That distinction mattered enough that the grandson underlined it in his notes. The structures had not disappeared. They had become difficult to recognize. The elder spoke about changes in the movement of water across the ground, changes in vegetation, changes in animal behavior around certain locations that his lineage had learned to notice over generations. To him, these were not mysteries. They were signs, evidence that something remained below the surface long after the people who built it had vanished from memory. By this point, the grandson had begun to understand that his grandfather was not describing a single tribe, a single settlement, or a single forgotten culture. He was describing an entire landscape that once functioned differently from the one surrounding them in 1888. The mines belonged to that landscape. The structures belonged to that landscape. The knowledge belonged to that landscape. And then the elder said something that would occupy the grandson for the rest of his life. The people before the silence, he explained, had understood that something was changing before everyone else did. Some left, some stayed. Some buried what they could not carry away, and some, this was the phrase the grandson struggled most to translate, had prepared certain things specifically for the people who would come after them. The English words he eventually settled on were sealed for later, not hidden forever, not destroyed, not abandoned, sealed for later. The old man believed many of the structures near the mines belonged to this category. They had not been erased by accident. They had not disappeared naturally. They had been placed beyond immediate reach deliberately, by people who expected someone else to find them when the conditions were right. The grandson wrote that his grandfather spoke about this with complete certainty, with no sense that he was offering speculation or legend. To the elder, this was inherited knowledge carrying the same status as the location of fishing grounds or the routes through winter forest. The difference was that one category of knowledge was shared freely. The other was carried carefully. Late on the third evening, the grandson finally asked the question that had been waiting behind every other question since the first night. What caused the silence? The old man remained quiet long enough that the grandson wondered whether he intended to answer. When he finally spoke, the response occupied only a few lines in the surviving notes. They were not taken by war. They were not taken by winter. Then a pause. They took too much at once. Another pause. And something answered. The old man never explained what had answered. The grandson never asked. By that point he had begun to understand something that only became clearer after his grandfather's death. Some knowledge survives because it is explained. Other knowledge survives because it is repeated exactly as it was received, without interpretation, without editing, without the well-meaning additions that gradually transform received history into something more comfortable and less true. His responsibility was not interpretation. His responsibility was preservation. Near sunset on the third day, the old man simply stopped speaking. There was no dramatic ending, no final warning, no final revelation. For 3 days he had carried his grandson through mines, forgotten shorelines, buried structures, vanished people, and a world that had existed long before the oldest stories anyone around him still remembered. Then there was nothing left to add. The burden had moved. 3 weeks later, he was dead. The grandson kept the document for the rest of his life. He shared parts of it carefully, reluctantly. Not because he believed the knowledge was dangerous, but because he believed it was easy to mishandle. There is a difference between those two things. And he understood the difference. Meanwhile, the world outside the cabin had been asking many of the same questions. Government surveyors were documenting ancient mining pits across the Lake Superior Basin. Archaeologists were struggling to explain the scale of extraction. Whittlesey's calculations of extracted copper volume, published in the 1860s, sitting in institutional records that the elder had never seen, produced figures between £1.5 billion and £2 billion. The trade network that moved Lake Superior copper south into Ohio, into Illinois, into Louisiana, into burial mounds and ceremonial sites separated by thousands of miles had been partially mapped. The evidence existed. The explanations kept arriving smaller than the evidence required. The mines remain. The stone hammers remain. The ancient pits on Isle Royale remain. The copper signature from Lake Superior continues appearing in archaeological sites scattered across an entire continent, and the question that troubled the old man in that cabin in the winter of 1888 remains stubbornly alive more than a century later. What kind of society was capable of organizing that work? Because mining at the scale the geological record suggests is not simply a technical problem. It is a logistical problem, a transportation problem, a food production problem, a labor coordination problem spanning generations. Those things do not exist in isolation. They require exactly the kind of organized, sustained, inherited infrastructure that the elder was describing across 3 days of careful testimony. The grandson eventually arrived at an answer to the question that had troubled him most: why his grandfather had waited until the final weeks of his life to speak. The elder had not been trying to convince anyone. He had not been trying to win an argument with historians or archaeologists who would never read his words anyway. He had simply reached the point where carrying the memory alone was no longer possible. The knowledge needed another carrier. That was the only reason that mattered. The old man believed something still existed beneath the forests of the upper Great Lakes. Not lost, not destroyed, waiting beneath shorelines, beneath soil that had gathered slowly over generations until memory faded faster than stone. Sealed for later in the words his grandson eventually settled on, by people who expected to be remembered, and who prepared certain things specifically for the generation that would finally be ready to look. That generation may be watching now. The question the elder left behind in the winter of 1888 is the same question the archaeological record has been producing ever since. Not from legend, not from oral tradition, but from stone hammers and pit volumes and isotope signatures and the arithmetic of missing copper that refuses to resolve. Who were the people standing on the shores of Lake Superior when the first hammer struck the first vein? The old man believed they expected to be found. Sudskareers if you want to keep following where the evidence leads, because this investigation is not finished, and neither is theirs.